Welcome to our continued study of the book of Hebrews. If you will recall from our outline, we have broken this book of Hebrews into 5 sections. We have thus far covered the first 2 of those sections, the supremacy of Christ and the snare of apostasy. We are now working on this 3rd section and have been in the last few lessons, the superiority of Christianity. And in this section, the writer is showing us that Christianity offers a better way than everything else. So as a recap, in the first section, we saw that God, in the past, God spoke to us through the prophets, but now he speaks through his son. And then he went on to prove that Christ is superior to everyone and everything. And then he issued us the first 2 of the 5 warnings that are found in this book. Then in that second section, we saw the 3rd of those 5 warnings, the warning against falling away, or the warning against apostasy. And finally, in this section, as I stated, we've broken this section into 6 subsections, of which we have already covered the first 4. We have covered the greater priesthood. We saw that the writer showed us that Christianity offers a better priesthood. Christianity offers a greater covenant. It offers a greater approach to God and a greater approach to the law. Now, we are now in this section going to see that Christianity offers a greater hope and a greater experience of worship. And so that is how we will be spending our time in this lesson. So let us jump right in. We are going to start out by reading this first section. We're starting out with one of my absolutely favorite chapters in the whole Bible, and that is the faith chapter. See, what the faith chapter does for us is catalogs the great works of our spiritual giants, our spiritual forefathers before us. It catalogs their great works. One of my favorite theologian professors uses the analogy of walking into a museum. Imagine walking into a museum with a long corridor, and as you walk along the corridor, you look on each of the walls as you pass, and you see examples, these wonderful pictures of these great people. And this is how this chapter lays out. We see the example as we walk down this hallway, examples of, by faith, Moses refused to be called, when he was of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. By faith, Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed. By faith. And so we look at example after example of these great giants who exercise faith in the middle of nothingness. And so we're inspired by that. And so that is what this chapter does for us, is inspires us to faith. And so this is why this is one of my favorite chapters. So the way that we are going to approach our study of this first section that we're calling A Greater Hope, the way that we're breaking it down into 2 sections, faith of our fathers and a better example for us. We're going to start out by reading this first section, the faith of our fathers, chapter 11, verses 1 through 38. So if you would, please follow along in your Bibles as we read chapter 11, verses 1 through 38. Okay. So, and we're reading from King James, from NIV. Now faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was invisible. By faith, Abel brought a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him in the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city of foundation, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky and countless as the sand on the seashore. And these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things now show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had not been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. Instead, they were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin for a season. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than all the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed, and those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, and others even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute and persecuted and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in the desert and in mountains, living in caves, and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what was promised. Since God had planned something better for us, that only together with us would they be made perfect. So let us take a closer look at the section that we have just read. We are going to take a look, first of all, at the first 3 verses. As you can see, the first 3 verses, the writer has used the first 3 verses to show the nature of faith. And then we're going to see in the next 4 and following, the next verses, we're going to see how faith behaves in real life. And so let us look first at the nature of faith. The writer tells us, first of all, it's the sense, it gives a sense of assurance and a certainty that there are realities that we cannot see. He tells us that the quality of the faith of the ancients is commended for those who triumph because of their faith. And so now we move into looking at the actual examples of faith that the writer gives us. We see, first of all, that the writer gives us an example of Abel. It says on verse 4, his offering came from a faithful heart, which means faith means trust and loving acceptance. So his faith, his offering was a better offering than Cain's. Why is that? To answer that question, we have to go back to Genesis. Let us go back. I'm just going to read. You don't have to go back in your Bibles. I'll read it for you. We go back to Genesis chapter 3, and we see that in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruit of the soil as an offering to the Lord. See, we have one brother that's a farmer and another brother that's a shepherd. And so in the first example, we see, notice the language in verse 3. It's in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of his soil as an offering. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of his firstborn, the firstborn of his flock. So the Lord looked with favor upon Abel. So you see the difference in the offering. God sees our heart. He sees our heart. Cain gave some, his leftovers, whereas Abel gave his best. And God wants our best. God doesn't want our leftovers. He wants our best. And so that is what that example gives us. We see the example of one who gave his best and one who gave his leftovers, and we see that God favored one of the other. Moving on. So verse 5 through 6, we see Enoch. There's another example. 2 things mark this character about Enoch. I won't go through Enoch, but we see that Enoch did not experience death. And some of the key things I want to note about that, he pleased God by turning from godlessness, because it says he was godless. The implication here is that he was godless before, until he had his first child. Until it says he maintained his daily walk with God after the birth of his son Methuselah, and for 300 years going forward. So you see that prior to having his child, he experienced godlessness, but then he turned to Christ. He turned to God, and so this is where his faith came in. And so this is one of the things he's commended for. One of the things that changes us, I believe, at least from my perspective, being a mom, I believe one of the things that changes us is having a child. Becoming a parent changes us. It drives us. It makes us want to be better. It causes us to rise to our best self, and at least in my experience. And so I believe this is what Enoch experienced, that once he had his child, his son, he wanted to be better, and so he sought a better way. And so then he enjoyed this intimacy with God, and not even death interrupted his fellowship. So those are faith means turning from human wisdom to God's revelation and walking in daily obedience. So that's the lesson that we get from Enoch in verses 5 and 6. Okay, and then we get an example of Noah in verse 7. Noah took God at his word, and heeding the warning, persisted in the face of opposition and ridicule. He was the first individual to be called righteous. with respect to Noah, Noah, keep in mind, the closest body of water was probably 200 miles away. So we're talking about a dry land. Noah was living in a dry land. And so when God told him that there was going to be a flood, you could see how ridiculous it would sound on his face. And so, despite that, he did as he was obedient. He listened to God. And Abel, Enoch, and Noah suggests that these three examples suggest that faith waits, faith grows, and faith persists. And so these are the examples that we get for these first 7 verses. So let's keep going and look at other activities of faith in verses 8 through 38. Faith makes people act and react differently. We see Sarah and Abraham as an example in verses 8 through 19. We see that, first of all, in verse 8, Abraham was told to leave Mesopotamia. Now, keep in mind, he was in the middle of a great life. He had a great life there. He had, lots of people working for him. He had an estate and house and property and land and all that. And God came along and said, hey, let's go. Let's get out of here. And he didn't ask where he was. He didn't have an idea where he was going. And so he left to go and live in the wilderness in tents, in temporary housing in tents. And so by faith, he did that, and by faith, Sarah went along with it, because anyone who is a wife, like myself, we know that we have certainly great influence over our husbands. I mean, happy life, happy wife, happy life. And you mean we're going to go, let me get this straight, Abraham. We're going to go and leave all my family and all my friends, and we're going to leave all my luxuries about life. And we're going to go live in the desert in tents. No, Abraham, you know. So Sarah could have given him the blues and certainly had an influence against the move, but clearly she went along with it. So she showed faith as well. They believed in the promises of God, the city of eternal foundations where people lived in peace, harmony, blessings, beauty. See, this is the things that he had in Mesopotamia. He had peace, harmony, blessings, beauty, willingly lived in, and he left all that to willingly live in tents his whole life. And Sarah shared in that faith. She believed nothing was too hard for God. And death did not even diminish their confidence. Abraham's greatest triumph was his willingness to sacrifice Isaac. The one child that had been promised. Remember, the angel came and promised and gave the promise to Sarah, was 90 years old. Abraham's 100, and the angel tells them that, you're going to have a child. And so there's clearly not another chance that if he sacrificed this child that he'd be able to have another one, but Abraham reasoned with himself that there's nothing that's too great for God, and if God has me to kill this child, God can raise him from the dead. And so that was his thought process. And so in that sense, God did not spare his own son and gave him up for us, but yet he spared Abraham's son. And in a way, Abraham did. Isaac was brought back from the dead because he was willing to kill him. And then we see in verses 20 through 22 some works of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We see that their own deaths, that they saw beyond their own deaths. They looked beyond their own deaths with unwavering faith. Isaac foretold the character of his twin sons. Jacob saw the true relationship of Manasseh and Ephraim. Joseph gave instructions that Israel should carry his bones. So they all had faith. It showed us faith in action. And then in 23 through 29, we see Moses and the Israelites. We see 5 highlights. His parents had faith in hiding their son. We see that he gave up treasures of Egypt. We see that he persevered in Midian for 40 years. We saw that he sprinkled blood on the Israelites' doorsteps and their doorposts. And he believed the sea would divide when he got there with the Israelites, that the sea would divide and then drown the Israelites chasing them. And so the example that we get from this section 23 through 29, the lesson we get is that God doesn't send believers into the sea, a sea of troubles to drown. He promises to see us through these things. And so Moses' faith was strong because his eyes were in the right place. So he kept his eyes fixed on God. He didn't look to the side and see how scary the waves looked that were rising around him. And he didn't look. He looked straight. He kept his eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And so that is the example for us. And so then we notice that there's a gap of 40 years. Do we notice that when we have these examples of, all the other, and then we have the forefathers, and then we have a 40-year gap. Well, that's because this is the time of the 40-year time in the wilderness that the Israelites went around moping and groping and complaining. And so then we pick up in verse 30 through 31 with Joshua and Rahab. And we see that Joshua, his faith displayed at the wall of Jericho. And then we see Rahab and her faith displayed in putting her life in jeopardy and saving it and hiding the spies. So she was convinced that Yahweh was truly God. Now, in sections 32, in verses 32 through 38, we see 6 other names that are mentioned from this period of Judges all the way through to the early monarchy. We see, first of all, that Gideon is mentioned and his victory over Midian. We see that Barak is mentioned and how he defended the army of Sisera. And then Samson, how he delivered the Israelites from the Philistines. And then Jephthah, how he conquered the Ammonites. And then David and Samuel are mentioned, and we know all their works, the 2 early monarchy. And then others are simply listed as prophets, and they would include Elijah and Elisha, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel. They're just mentioned. And then we see that the faith of these led them to 3 kinds of actions. In verses 33 and 34, we see that these actions of these that were aforementioned were to govern. They conquered kingdoms, administered justice. We saw that their actions led to help others to triumph over fears and odds. We saw lions, them triumph over lions, flames, the sword. And we can see that their actions led them to be mighty in battle, that it led them to conquer weakness and have weakness turned into strength. It led them to rout foreign armies. And so those actions were as a result of their faith. Then we see the women of faith, that they received dead loved ones back to life. We saw several examples of these. The widow of Zaphrah. We saw the Shunammite woman. We saw the widow of Nain, Mary and Martha, who received Lazarus back. The widow of Joppa. We saw that widow Dorcas was restored to the other widows. And so we see that during these days of cruelty, these people were tortured. Look at Jeremiah, who's tortured and stoned. Isaiah, who was sawed in half. We see Elijah and Elisha and John the Baptizer, who were subjected to extreme poverty. And all of them were unacceptable and unrecognized, but yet they stood firm in their faith. And this covers the section, the faith of our fathers. This section, chapter 11, verses 1 through 38.